Thank you very much. Okay, well, everyone, welcome to the 113th episode, straight episode of History Matters, and so does coffee. And it has mattered for 113 weeks, so it will always matter. Today, we're going to be talking about, in a way, I think I called it broadening the American story or something like that. And what I'm going to be saying today isn't necessarily new to people who are out there listening today, but it's a reminder and a kind of tribute to this. And it came to mind for me because of something I experienced this last week. But before I plunge into that, I am going to turn to Annie, my partner in crime, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee, sponsored by the National Council for History Education. If you are not already a member or have not had a chance to hop on their website, ncheteach.org sponsors this wonderful community every Friday morning. And we welcome you to put your questions in the Q&A. The chat goes by so fast and furious, and I want to make sure I don't lose any of those great questions. So if you could just do that one thing for me, we will have some time for questions at the end. Great, let's go, Joanne, we're ready.
Excellent, okay. Spiffy. Okay, so I'm going to start out with something really obvious. Actually, let me change my view here. Okay. I'm going to start out with something very obvious and then explain how we're going to be segueing into talking about that today. Obviously, for generations, when people have been telling the American story, and of course there actually isn't one, but still, when people have been talking about American history for many moons, it was a largely white male endeavor. That's who we included. That's who was considered the real history. And over the years, that story has been broadened and has become more inclusive in all kinds of ways. And I'm not going to go into depth in all of those ways. But we can see today, and particularly by looking at some of the efforts to erase from the past some of these other people, these other central aspects of American history, just sort of eliminate them from the story, and related to that, efforts to dismiss people related to those non-white, non-male parts of the American story, to dismiss their significance or not include them and act against them in a variety of different ways. We can see the legacy of acting as though American history only involves a very small little group of people. To do that, and you can look around today and see it, right? If you were to tell the story of the present, and I'm going to come back to this point at the end, if you were to tell the story of the present by talking about what still majority men in different rooms did legislatively or in the presidency or, you know, on a very high level, if you were to do that and not do anything else, that's not going to be the story of this period. I mean, just think about what you have and are experiencing over the last, you fill in the blank, how many years. And you know in your gut that if you want to understand the story of this period, that particular exclusive narrative is not going to do it. So I want to talk a little bit about how we tell that story and some of the tools that we use. And as I suggested a moment ago, I kind of want to offer a tribute to it because of an experience I had on Memorial Day. And a friend took me to a Memorial Day ceremony in a Portuguese Jewish cemetery on the Lower East Side, which apparently is only open one day a year, and that's Memorial Day. It's very, very small. I don't know, there were maybe 20 people maybe buried there. But what was distinctive about it is they were Revolutionary War veterans. And so that Memorial Day service, although there was mention of all different kinds of veterans, it was very explicitly targeted at Revolutionary War veterans. And apparently, I'm going to get the name of the congregation right. congregation Sharif Israel is a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. I think the oldest in the city. I think there are 3 separate, very small burial grounds for former members of the congregation. But at any rate, this was interesting, and I was interested to go and see. I knew that it was going to be revolution focused, so my historian antenna were up. What was interesting to me was, and I spent some time walking around and looking at names and looking at birth and death years, and the graves, for the most part, noted what military company they said. This company, Revolutionary War or something. So it was noted where they had served, and some of them had been in this, clearly served together. Anyway, so I was walking around kind of trying to reconstruct for myself some vague aspect of who these people were, because I've just never been in a space dedicated to that, right? I knew all kinds of people fought on the side of the patriots, the rebels during the revolution. Jewish people did, African-American people did, all kinds of people did. And I knew that, right? I teach the American Revolution. So in a sense, I didn't necessarily expect to go there and have an aha experience, but I kind of did. And here's what surprised me. There was a Memorial Day, service. Like the assistant rabbi of this congregation led it. It was live streamed. I actually don't know if it's online. It might be. And after there was a discussion of the meaning of Memorial Day, there was, it went from grave to grave of these Revolutionary War veterans. I don't know, maybe they went to about 10 graves, and just told the story of that person's life. None of these people, there's one person whose name I recognized because I know his son, right? So I was like, that's his father. I'll come back to him in a minute. That was odd too, right? That's a historian going to cemeteries thing, is that you go to old cemeteries. This is also true of the Grove Street Cemetery at Yale. The first time I went walking through there, I was like, he's here and he's here. And he, so you sort of feel like historical characters in some way. So that was my experience. Oh, that's his dad. But generally speaking, I didn't know their names, but their life stories were fascinating. Particularly because these were not renowned individuals in a broad sense. In their community at the time, they were. For some of them in New York history, and actually for a handful of them, possibly in revolutionary history, but generally speaking, these were New Yorkers, Portuguese Jews. A lot of them were merchants, so some of them were wealthy. And among those merchants, a lot of them gave money to fund different parts of the revolution. So for example, let's see, I'm gonna get their names correct. I believe this guy was named Jacob Hart, who advanced money to the Marquis de Lafayette to clothe and feed his troops, right? So I have his birth and death year here. They created this very nice program for the ceremony. I saw his name, his birth and death year, but I looked at this and I thought, oh, he had advanced money to Lafayette and the Continental Congress thanked him, which I thought was worth noting, right? I thought that was interesting. But the stories that stayed with me and the aspect of this that led me to talk about what I want to talk about today is there were a lot of, in a way, less noteworthy stories. There were stories about, there was one fellow who came to the colonies as an indentured servant, and ultimately, I think, managed to free himself from that position. I don't know if he waited until the terms of his indenture ended, and went from a job to job to job, sort of working his way up until for a brief period, I believe, he might have been the president of the congregation. He had 21 children. So this guy who came as an indentured servant, right? And I don't think I even, sadly, I might not even be able to point to who this person is, which is a little bit horrible. At any rate, I'm sorry, sir, but this is a tribute to you anyway. He worked his way up, right? And again, this sort of, pull yourself up immigrant stories, hardly something new. But thinking about the American Revolution, thinking about the fact that this small cluster of people all fought in it, thinking about the ways in which they found their way into the revolution, that they served together, their stories intermingled, right? So there's one man, I think, who was killed during the revolution, and his kids went to live with another person in the cemetery, right? It was a kind of a community and a sort of historical sensibility that was being recreated there. And the one that really struck me the most was his name, I'm going to remember, because I even looked up how to pronounce it. Gershom Mendes Seixas, or Seixas, I think Seixas, Seixas. And he led the Share Israel congregation. He, at a very, again, this is the story that we were told while we were standing there above him. He apparently, at a very early point in the revolution, joined the Patriot side, preached in the synagogue sermons that were supportive of what was happening in the colonies and definitely attacking British policy. Come back here because the string of things is really striking. He ends up at one point closing the synagogue and removing the Torah scrolls to Connecticut to keep them safe. I believe, if I remember correctly, that his house ends up getting burned down. His wife, and he escapes because he's the person the British want. His wife won't reveal to the British where her husband is. And while the British are there, his kids take their livestock and lead them quietly away so that the British won't get a hold of them. And apparently there was a 7-year-old son. I don't know if his name was given. The 7-year-old son of this guy was helping move the livestock. And a descendant of that 7-year-old guy was there and planted a flag for Memorial Day. So, I've been teaching the revolution for several decades now. What this experience reminded me was the power of granular history of a sort, right? And it's not, again, there's nothing new about my saying that the everyday matters, that people who are not white and elite matter, that we need to make our national story, first of all, that it isn't one story. And secondly, if as one story, when we tell it as one story, it has to be much more inclusive. But the power of details and people and individual life stories. We see, there's a book on the American Revolution that I'm now not going to remember. I think it's a People's History of the American Revolution that I use in my revolution course because it does that, right? It talks about the average soldier, African-American soldiers. And that's ideally gives students some version of what I was having there, which is, this is like a whole community of small community of Portuguese Jews who mingled and intermingled and stood up at this moment, and in one way or another, often paid a price for it. And there was a reality to it that as much as I could sit here before Memorial Day and tell you stories, right? And I've had students, I had a senior essay writer, undergrad once write a senior essay. There was a diary he was using of a man whose family divided between loyalists and patriots. And he told that family story, which is a version of this, right? Like what specifically happened there and what was that like for your family to be divided? But the power of that, particularly when it's attached to big events, to things that you think that you think you even know on a more granular level, but you haven't stopped for a moment and thought about what did it mean to stand up and preach that kind of sermon and then, basically have to run away, and your wife sort of having to stand up for herself, and, the kids trying to sort of save some of the family's belongings. There are stories like that recounted in all kinds of historical, scholarship. but getting down to that kind of granular level in that sort of area in a cemetery with people who, except for Mr. Noah. What is Mr. Noah's first name? Manuel Noah. I'll come back to him momentarily. He's the one guy who I knew, his son. But other than that, I didn't necessarily know anyone, but I came away from that morning with a sense of a community up in arms and engaged with each other and doing what they could at that moment to engage with something that they believed in. And I just hadn't had that in my gut in the same way I did standing in that cemetery with a good number of people who were descendants of the people who were buried there. That was just really striking to me. And so it reminded me and got me thinking about the different ways in which not just life stories, but individual life stories or family history, right? Like the 7-year-old kid leading livestock away and the descendant sort of being there to plant a Memorial Day flag. Everyday things like someone dying and the kids going to this other person about 3 feet away. I think it was the 21 kids person who actually took in those kids. I guess once you have 21, what's 22 or 23? Or the power of things, right? Of all of these things that are ordinary, all of these things that historians have long recognized have a real power in fleshing out and creating an understanding of the reality of history. But I think it's easy to forget the power of that. And I don't know, actually, during the Q&A period here, I'm going to be interested to see what you have to say. As I said a moment ago, I incorporate this into my revolution class all the time, this idea, like, what's it like to be a colonist? What's it, not just 8 guys in a room, but to get at the sort of ground level reality of it in a way that would touch students differently from what they thought before, and whether that means really down to a family level or an object, right? Or something that brings you down to an actual real person, an actual real moment. There's a power to that I'm, in a sense, I'm offering a tribute to today. And I thought of a number of different things that pieces of scholarship that move in that direction, and I think show this really well. One of them is very recent. Taya Miles wrote All That She Carried, which I think won a lot of awards. And it's basically about a sack that a woman gave her daughter with a handful of precious items just to keep. So she would always have it with her, and then the daughter and the mother get separated. And so that sack becomes a memory and in a sense, the reality of what came before. And the book unpacks that and looks at these items and what they meant and what they show. And that's a great example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, particularly because, it's a person, and it's the sack, I think, is at the Smithsonian. You wouldn't necessarily even need to know a lot about the people behind the item for that to be a powerful component in getting across the reality of the past on a level that some students will not have thought of before. Another person who does this is Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who has written about needlecraft and quilts, again, as a form of history. And, I was thinking as I was drawing up my comments today, historians tend to refer to this craft of using things to get at history as material culture, which is precisely what it is, right? It's the culture of material objects and how they can help you understand history. But I think in a way that phrase distances what I'm talking about here for the average person, right? Material culture sounds more sophisticated than what I'm talking about here, even though it's the same thing. It sounds like, a methodological approach, and thus that there's something daunting about it, and you need to have some kind of special knowledge to just engage in that kind of thinking, which you do. I, as a political historian, I have my own, training that allows me to do it. But the general idea of things as history, and the fact that things can reveal so much about history and so much about people and so much about events and communities, just an object. That's just something that I think it's worth noting. And again, I'm sort of singing an ode to that today, because it, anyway, like anything, I suppose this is part of what I'm also getting at. Anything that touches me in that way, in a different way, on an emotional level or a gut level, something that sort of makes me pause for a moment and think, oh, I hadn't felt that before, or I hadn't thought that before. That's just worth, and the same is true for you, that's worth stopping and thinking about what it is that has reached you on that level. Because obviously as teachers, that's invaluable, because if it's touching you on that level, you can use that. You can use the fact that you were touched, and you can use whatever has been doing the touching to teach, right? You can, the fact that what happened, like my being here and saying I was moved at this Memorial Day ceremony, that fact in and of itself could be educational in teaching my students. And then talking about what moved me that way, those things become a way of teaching too. So I'm sure many of you already do this, but it was such a powerful reminder to me about that kind of granular power. Two other things I want to mention. As far as quilts, I found a quote. There's a historian named Daryl Hafter, who I believe is emeritus now, and wrote a good amount of work on sort of women at work. So this is her insight. Particularly, she wrote a lot about quilts. She writes about quilts as windows into customs, human relationships, and individual awareness accompanying events from the past. So customs, human relationships, and individual awareness. All you could see how all of those things could be reflected in a quilt, and how all of those things are hard to get at historically, or even when you're talking about all of those well-preserved paper documents from largely, elite white guys and some elite white women and a number of others. You can see how, in essence, objects can be an archive. And that's really important to think about. Objects as an archive, this kind of thinking as a different way of considering what goes in an archive, may not be paper. It's certainly something that a lot of historians have been thinking about and writing about in the semi-recent past, about the fact that we have to question archives, because we know kind of what's there, but we don't often think about what isn't there. And archives are selective, and archives reflect a very particular view of what counts as history. And once you have that awareness, you then have to think about what you do, what kinds of questions you ask, what kinds of places you go to, what kinds of evidence you use to get at all of the things around the things that were deemed important enough to be history at some point in the past. The last person I want to mention who does this in a different kind of a way is Wendy Warren. She wrote a book called New England Bound, but the article that I'm thinking of here is called The Cause of Her Grief, The Rape of a Slave in Early New England, which won an award. What was noteworthy about that was, how do we know what this enslaved woman felt who was raped? And I believe not even the 18th century, might have been the late 17th century, New England. How in the world do you tell that story? And Wendy did a really creative and inventive essay on what you can pull from what she has to weave together, and in some cases using sort of conventional artifacts, in other cases pulling at the words that other people use to describe things. She constructs a way of understanding what happened that is not just grounded on saved archived paper documents. And it was controversial at the time because of what she did, which she acknowledged. She went to Yale, and so she was in my classes, so I know Wendy. And I remember her talking about how some people loved this article, The Cause of Her Grief. It's from the Journal of American History, 2007. Some people loved it. It won a prize, and some people were really kind of disturbed by what she was doing. All of these things that I'm talking about are just reminders that instead of looking at material culture as separate from the real history, or women's history as separate from the real history, or African American history, or any other history as being like an add-on. Like, wouldn't it be great if we include this, like tack it on to the real story? It is the real story. It's all the real story. And there are ways to get at it that have a real emotional and intellectual weight that are worth thinking about and definitely worth incorporating into our teaching. And I come back to where I started, which is thinking about the current moment that we're in and thinking about how the history of this moment might be told. And thinking about, you could talk about what happened during the Trump and Biden presidencies. You could talk about COVID policies or lack of policies. You could talk about any number of things, and they would get across a lot of what's going on now. To me, thinking about this moment, some of the things I think about are the things that suddenly became difficult that hadn't been difficult before. Getting food, figuring out what to do. How serious was it? Where do you turn? The anxiety of the moment, the contingency, someone gets bingo, of the moment, the reality of this moment, the experience of this moment. And in that sense, the distinctiveness of this moment, because it certainly feels different from any moment I've seen during my 60 years of being alive. That matters. And that's not going to come across from those very conventional paper documents and large legislative acts, and voting patterns and everything else that are important, but are not the whole story. So in a sense, a great way to think about broadening how we tell our history is to think about how you might want to tell the story of now, and what would you include? What would you want to get across as far as ideas and realities? And what would you use to do that? I way back, I don't know how many bazillion episodes ago, I talked about how important it was to keep a diary in these times, because you were going to be recording things that you could never have imagined before these times, and that you might forget the reality of after these times. There's a reality there of what this time really means that can't be captured in many other ways. So that's this episode today is kind of a tribute to that realization, and encouraging you to think about how you do that in the past by thinking about how you might do that in the present. Okay, and I see the mug. You guys know when I'm like moving in towards the finish here. Okay, so the mug, if there's anyone new here, for 113 weeks, I have had a mug that's thematically related to whatever I'm talking about. You're going to have to travel with me a little bit on this one, okay? I really was trying to think about like the everyday, what can I get that's like the everyday that yet is still history. And I believe that someone sent me this mug. So it's a History Matters mug. And I can't remember who gave it to me, because at this point I'm lost. So someone out there can figure it out. It says, I turn coffee into books. And to me, that was pretty close to what I was talking about, right? It's taking the everyday and creating history out of it. And boy, in my life, coffee is pretty much every day. So if someone now is watching who gave me this mug because it was one of our community, please pipe up. But I thought this was actually, in the end, a pretty good way of piping into today's theme. And hopefully I will soon be turning coffee into books. Okay, so now I want to open things up to questions. There's Annie. Hello.
We have questions. We have lots of great questions as always. So Dale has one that I love because I love children's books. He's asking, what is your view on using historical fiction for children to tell the stories of everyday people in the revolution? But I'm going to add to Dale's question, any time period, not just the revolution, right?
Well, personally, I think that's okay. I don't teach young children. So I'm speaking based on, instinct and not direct knowledge. And some of you out there are going to actually have more information on this than I do. But I think if you make it clear what you're doing, right, that it's a story, but the story is getting at what it really felt like, I don't know how that's a bad thing, right? In one of my years of teaching the American Revolution, I ended the semester by assigning Gore Vidal's Burr novel. I've never done it before. I might have done it once or twice since, but I assigned it, and I made it really clear, like, this is fiction. But somehow or other, based on the way I taught the class that semester, it captured so many of the themes and it made them real in a way that fiction can, that I thought, well, wouldn't this be an interesting thought experiment for the students? And I think it worked pretty well, right? I think it got them thinking in a different kind of a way. So I don't see how doing the same thing for students of any age would be a bad thing, as long as you're making it clear what you're doing, right? I mean, you guys tell me, you can inform me on this front, but that is my gut response. There was not a drawback to what I did. I didn't have students, sort of leaving and saying, that day when Burr stood on a field, it's like, we don't know Burr. It didn't have that, but I did have students who had a kind of gut feel for that moment in a way that they might not have had.
Yeah. I've used it a lot as a teacher. You got to be really careful what you pick. The person has to be really good, make sure it's all fact-based. But also when there's a bad one, we've had kids as an exercise deconstruct and fact check, right? And then write to the author and say, hey, we think this is not correct. And usually they don't write back if it's wrong because they don't like to admit that but the ones that are really good, they will write back and thank the kids, and they will,
Oh, that's great. That's the best lesson.
That's exciting to kids, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Tom is asking, many of the recent books on the American Revolution, such as Serena Zabin's book on the Boston Massacre, does a great job bringing the past to life, looking at the experience from the perspective of common people. Do you agree this is a good trend in research and writing in history?
Yes. Next. No, really. Yes. I think it's interesting, and this is also not a new thought, but American history and early American history for so long was so dominated by the stories of elite white men. And that in the 60s, beginning with social history in the 1960s, began to be pushed aside. And there were all of these other kinds of people, common people, that needed to get brought into the narrative, and thus the vision and the focus needed to change. And so that's been going on for a time. What's interesting is every now and again, there's a nervous, like someone like me who actually does write about the elites, by no means arguing that they're the only people you need to write about. Actually, quite the opposite. I mostly am saying, don't forget these guys, because they actually have power that everybody else has to engage with in some way. But every once in a while, there's a kind of what always feels to me like a knee-jerk, like, stop talking about the elites, which is born of this sense that if you let them have an inch, they're going to take a mile, right? The elites, everyone wants to talk about the elites. So yeah, I think it was crucial when it started. It remains crucial. It is the history, and you can see, based on some of the battles we see today over what's being taught, over what counts as history, over what is even being discussed as something that people shouldn't talk about. I'm not going to let myself go down that trail because I'm going to get really upset. But all of the ways in which you're watching people try to put up fences right now, one way to not allow that to happen is for people to understand all of the things that are on the other side of those fences, so that it'll be really clear what's being cut off. So yeah, I think it's hugely important. And I applaud everybody that's doing it, because as I said before, it's not add-on history. It is the history, right? History is people engaging with each other in all kinds of ways. I write about the political elite, but the political elite are engaging with all kinds of other peoples as part of, like public opinion and campaigns and voting, they're not in a bubble of isolation. And the same thing is true on the other side, right? That people out in the world engaging in whatever they're engaging in, if they want something, if they want power, if they want change, they're going to have to engage with people who have power to get it. So not everyone has to write about everything, but there's a lot that needs to be incorporated, and finding ways to weave it together or to tell stories in different ways that make it clear that some threads can be pulled together in ways that they haven't been. That's hugely important.
I agree. And kids do find that fascinating for sure. This one comes from Ann Bradford. She asked, why does a certain type of scholar sneer at the anecdotal? It wasn't until I read Laurel Ulrich's book on the midwife's diary that I thought history had anything to offer me as a student who much preferred anthropology.
Oh, interesting. Well, so anecdotal and anthropology are not necessarily the same, or I'm not sure. Do you mean?
She's asking why you think that some scholars sneer at the anecdotal, I think is a question. Like, what is it that they find so distasteful, I guess?
Well, I think probably a couple things. I think in part, if you are really interested in particular in the history of ideas, in looking at patterns and things from that kind of perspective, it might feel very reductive to use an anecdote as representative or as symbolic or something. I don't think that's as common today than it might have been once, because I think there's more of a realization that the human experience and the human story is part of what we're telling. That said, part of that sneering might also come from the fact that books that include that kind of anecdote sometimes are books that are aimed at the public. That gets sneered at. That is something that not everyone is comfortable with, right? I very clearly have strong feelings about that too. Very strong feelings about that. But because I think it's quite possible to write history, scholarly history that's saying new things in a way that's accessible and interesting and exciting, and that not only historians are going to want to read, but and I think the trend when I was applying to grad school 1,000 years ago, it was just not acceptable to write for the public. It was just like, no, and that's not true anymore. But still, I discovered this even with my last book. There were some people who dismissed it, historians who dismissed it because it was for the public. Like, well, it wasn't only for the public, thank you. And if you think that, what are you saying about the size of your audience? I want to reach a lot of people. I want to change or have an impact on how we understand our history for historians. And I want a lot of people to understand some of the things that I'm saying about. So at any rate, I think all of that's kind of bound up in that sneer that you asked about.
Okay, this one comes from Miranda, who's a genealogist. She asked, how can I weave the personal history of someone with the larger historical story of the time when the story is the cliche, he was a farmer, he had X number of kids, lived and died, without having to like force the issue? She's wondering what your take is as.
Say that again, because I'm not sure I got the question.
She's saying that she's trying to weave in these personal stories, but how do you get beyond just he was a farmer, he had 21 kids, and then he died? Oh,
I see. I mean, I suppose in a way this almost gets back to a slight version of how do you use fiction. You could, so in a sense, what my mind was doing in that cemetery was what I'm suggesting here, which is this guy, like, he came here with nothing. And within this number of years, he built himself up. Like, and what did that mean? Like, what might he have had to do? What's the difference between where he ended up and where he started? And 21 kids, what does it mean to have 21 kids in that time period? In other words, you could build a structure on those facts, and some of that structure will be grounded on your sense of the moment and might not be like absolutely factually true, and you can say that. Let's think about what the human experience of this would be. Let's think about what this can tell us about the time period. You're not saying, so when this guy stood in a field and thought this, but you might be saying, what would it mean in that time period to ... And then I think those kinds of stories can have a real power. I feel like some of what I'm saying here is so commonsensical that I almost want to apologize for saying it, except I'll stop there. I feel like in some ways you teachers are like, yeah, Joanne, we've been doing this forever. But I just think it's important to sort of remind ourselves of it, certainly for me, and to remind others who maybe haven't thought that way.
Yeah. And there's teachers who do that, like without even, it's just how they live and breathe.
Exactly.
There's also some that don't, and it could be more compelling. Okay, so this one comes from Kathleen. She says, the complaint that I hear these days is there isn't time to add all these other stories, right, to history without taking away from the essentials. So how would you think of counterbalancing that?
Interesting. Okay.
A K-12 teacher or a history at the post-secondary level, she doesn't specify.
So I had an experience of this recently. I was on a panel and the subject was, how should we be teaching American history? And some of the people who answered in a very broad thematic way, which I found actually really fascinating, particularly in one case. Part of what I said was, you're not going to be surprised at all. And I think I even mentioned you in the answer, right? I was like, whatever you're teaching people, you should be teaching contingency. There's no of courses. There aren't any now, and there weren't any in the past, and that dramatically changes how you understand things. And you could do that. Just talk about the Constitution or the Revolution. Like pick something. And the founding period I always use as an example because it's so many assumptions. Just the phrase "the founding." It's like, well, of course, the founding means something was founded, right? What if we don't assume that? So that tends to be my ultimate example. What if we don't assume there was a constitution? Anyway, so that was the way I talked. And at the end, someone came up to me and said, yeah, there's no time to teach that kind of stuff. Now, if you're teaching about the Constitutional Convention and you're teaching about the different interests and ideas that went into the creation of the Constitution, framing that discussion with a brief reminder that no one knows what the heck they're doing and no one knows how it's going to turn out, and really driving that home. I think you can make that point and drive that point home and reiterate that point throughout a class without necessarily using a lot of time. So I think that's part of the answer. It was just so fascinating to me. Someone's like, we don't have time to do that. And I was like, wait, what, huh? Like I understand that entirely, but I also know that you can get across a lot without having to go into the detail that you want to go into with other subjects. I sort of feel like here I am talking to a lot of teachers who are going to be like, no. So anything that I'm saying here that does not make sense in your experience, I bow to your experience. But I think you can get across sensibilities and assumptions, and you can look through the eyes of the people you're writing about in some kind of a general way, or at least encourage people to think along those lines without necessarily taking a lot of time. So getting students to look forward in time instead of assuming, as they all do, that what you do is look back. If you're looking forward in time, what's happening looks very different. People don't know what's coming next. And that's just, I think, important to do.
Yeah. All right, this one comes from our friend CC. She says, what happens if and when the storytellers are embellishing or just out and out untruthful at this moment with all the CRT controversy? She says, we have a lot of places and people trying to suppress real history. Right. How can we be more optimistic about the future histories of the present?
Right. I was going to say, I don't know if there's a simple
question there.
It's a big question. It's an important question. And absolutely, like, what do you do? Yubi's essentially dancing over there.
Yubi's got a lot to say.
He has a lot to say on this. What do you do if either someone is aggressively saying something incorrect that is particularly aiming things in one direction or another, or aggressively not including something? And how do you respond to that? I mean, I think there's different answers for different people. You know, I think teachers are under siege right now for that, because, you know, if you're trying to be inclusive and trying to actually offer a sense of the complexity of the past, there are going to be other people that are kind of come down on your head for, you know, no, it's critical race theory, which it isn't. You know, I think, to me, when all else fails, and again, I truly feel like I'm like, let me tell you what to do. But for me, when I feel that something I want to say might be a little sensitive to people, I go to a primary document. I don't say it myself.
Mhm.
I come back to say it after the document does, but I'll be like, you know, well, let's look at something from that time period. Let's look at it. What does it say? What is it? Wow, what does that sound like to you? So you can kind of see how ... Primary documents, and, you know, depending on the level of the student, for college students, having them work through a primary document with you can be really powerful as a way of getting at what's happening beneath the words. But I think, generally speaking, primary documents mean that it's not you in front of a classroom, you know, as a CRT person, you know, would say like, you're in front of the classroom and indoctrinating children. It's like, no, we're teaching about the past, and this is a person in the past and what they thought, so let's talk about it. Yeah. That's not going to solve all the problems, but I think it's at least a tool, you know, in that sense, a weapon, to empower you to talk about the past in a way that's grounded, so that no one can say you're making this up, it's bad history. You know, they could say it, but you are not, you know, you're using actual evidence. Again, that's I feel like that's a very simple response to a very complicated question, but that's certainly one tool that I use all the time. If I think that it's going to be hard for students to understand something or believe something, or in a lecture, if I think people aren't really going to either understand or believe what I'm saying, I always go immediately to a primary document, or an actual story grounded on primary documents, because, you know, my authority as a historian should always be enough, and yet it isn't. And so, you know, there evidence really helps. Concrete evidence really helps. Even occasionally on Twitter, concrete evidence really helps.
Yeah, I think, you know, with all the CRT nonsense, we've seen teachers, you know, turning it, like you said, back to a primary source. And the other piece is then a lot of times we'll invite the students like, well, if you heard that on this particular news channel, or you saw this, you know, this particular political figure is saying this, can you find a primary source to back up their version?
Right.
And then the kids have this aha moment, like, oh,
right. Well, exactly. And I've actually, I won't go into the detail on the topic that this is relating to, because we try not to be political here on History Matters, but there was a case in which a student came to me with a very clear sense of what needed to be the truth, born of what she was thinking about the present. And I wanted her to at least think about other possibilities. I wasn't going to tell her what to think. But so, you know, I gave her some topics to look at that by definition were going to force her to look at different kinds of evidence that conflicted, and she was going to have to sort of rethink what she assumed had to be true, which it did, right? And she came to me and said, but wait, like some people were saying this and other people were saying that. I was like, yeah, because, you know, so sometimes that could be the best way, right? This gets back to evidence. I'm obviously crazy about using primary evidence in documents. And as I've written before, and we did an episode, I think, even of History Matters on using primary documents. But as I say to my students, you know, if you're reading a letter from the 18th or 19th century, that represents an action. That's a person who sat down and felt a need to write this down and send it off. And it wasn't necessarily easy to do, and it cost money, and it took time. And some people considered it a pain in the patooties to have to write those kinds of letters. So what happened to that moment that made that person think they needed to sit down and write that letter? Where was that person sitting? What had that person just done? What events might have just happened that compelled them to do that? What's the relationship of the person to the person they're writing to? What's all of the space around that letter? What can that tell you about that moment? And then all of a sudden, the letter, because I just saw someone say, I always thought primary documents were boring. This kind of approach is part of what I encourage as a way to get past the like, oh, it's just a piece of paper with a letter on it. It's a historical event, not in the sense of great importance, but it's an action that happened in the past. So why did it happen? And what can we understand if we see it as an action and not as a document?
Yeah. So I can't believe it. We've answered all the questions. That never happens.
That does never happen.
Somebody adds one the next couple of minutes. I did want to tell you, and I just realized I forgot to switch it to everyone instead of host and panelists. So
Oops.
Everything I put in the chat this morning, only you and John saw. So
oh
I do that all the time, and Carolee used to always remind me. So
no. Is there something we can do about that?
I wish Zoom would have that be the default, but it doesn't. But I was going to say, I did put it back in there now for everybody, I think. I don't know, Joanne, if you're familiar with Kelly Fanto-Dietz's work, but she's a historian here in Virginia, and she now works at Stratford Hall, which is the Lee family home. And she's doing a very cool workshop this summer that we're going to do a little piece of with her. And it's all about letters and diaries. The whole topic for the week, and it's virtual this year, it's not on site, it's called Reading Over Other People's Shoulders, Letters and Diaries. So she's bringing different historians to kind of speak to that, and using lots of private sources, which will be really fun.
Very cool.
Okay, I want to make sure we didn't. Oh, there's 3 people have added 3 more questions. Carolee asks, she wants to ask you about the Farrah Fawcett poster to talk about the 80s and big hair.
So this is related. So even though it's popular culture, it is. I was watching past episodes of the TV show Stranger Things, which is very firmly planted in the 80s, and they go out of their way, the music and the posters and the kids' rooms and everything else, really, really 80s. And it made me, and I think I tweeted about it, right? Boy, that brought me right back, like, bam, to the 80s. And the things that define, again, kind of like what I was saying before, the things that defined it for me, which are not going to define it by far. I was a middle-class kid in Yorktown Heights, New York, middle-class white kid in Yorktown Heights, New York, but still, there are a lot of things that define the period in a general kind of a way, but my experiences of it, my big hair, wow, did I have big hair? And there was a picture that I posted of me with big hair, and I had shoulder pads and the whole shebang. But I remember, that was the period, I think, where there were like power suits with this little stupid bow tie thing that women were wearing that had to kind of look like men, but make it look female. And I hated that. I hated it with a passion. I hated the way it looked. I hated that I had to do it. So there I was, kind of not knowingly, like having these like little feminist thoughts, like, why do I have to look like a man? I look like a man. So, that's minor and individual and anecdotal. But that's a thing that certainly a factoid that would tell you something about the 80s and where we were and where we weren't in that time period. Some other people saw that picture too. Yeah.
And in our Slack group, for those of you who aren't familiar, we have a Slack channel where during the week in between Fridays, we continue the conversation. So if you're interested in joining the History Matters community Slack channel, put your information in there, and Reese will have to hook you up because she does all that magically. Someone was asking about the Ashley Sachs, so I think I've put that in the chat for everybody to see. They wanted to follow up on that book that you suggested. Tom is asking if you could use your new favorite word, morbs, in a sentence.
You guys, okay.
Morbs, I don't think it's on bingo. I think he's just asking.
No, I was going to say, I wouldn't imagine it. But here's the thing about that, actually. I'm really good at converting things into the moment. So what this refers to is, I saw again on Twitter, someone mentioned the word morbs, 19th century, like I've got the morbs, meaning I'm feeling kind of morbid or depressed or sad. And I thought, wow, that's handy. Like, that's just useful. Like, I got the morbs. Feels like something that I will want to say at some point. But what's wonderful about that, and I think about this a lot in early America, is that there are all kinds of weird, look at me, my phone dinging, shame on me. There are all kinds of weird sayings and things like that that vanish because they're spoken and not necessarily written down. And you forget what spoken English sounds like versus written English. And that's particularly true in periods that are further away from the present, when, what we see in writing, we all imagine this very stiff, formal, way in which people sound in writing. And then there are all of these things happening in personal engagement that we don't see otherwise. And that's happened to me a number of times in studying early America. I heard, I read somewhere like 1799, someone wanted to give someone else a good, swift kick in the A. And I was like, really? Like 1799? Who knew, right? Or 1800, I saw someone say, he told me this, how dare he? It's as good as saying, kiss my A and go to H. 1800, right? So what I love about that is that's not how we imagine early America. People were saying these things, right? So the morbs is another example of that someone, I think, looked at a dictionary or something. There was some way, like sayings of the 19th century. I can't remember the tweet that had it. But that's another great example of things that aren't part of the actual archive, but that bring you right back down to a human level.
A lot of people are saying they like that word, the morbs.
It's good.
I also think it'd be a good band name.
It would be. That would be true too. It would be an excellent band name. Okay, we are now actually a little over.
We just had 2 last minute questions. I don't know if you want to try and squeeze those in, but one of them
we can do. Oh, go ahead. We can do. Okay. If they're quick, we can do it really
quick. But one's very quick. Commenting on the role of historical interpreters at these historical sites, how they bring to life the time period. He's just asking, like, do you have any thoughts on that? Clint, this is from Dale.
Oh, Dale, who knows? Colonial Williamsburg. Right. I mean, I think people standing in a place of history, talking about that history, can have a real power. I think those kinds of history interpreters are hugely important. And I don't always think that just like this is true of not all teachers, I don't think all people in that space realize the degree to which what they say in that space is going to have a real power over the people standing there. So I actually think historical interpreters at historical spaces are hugely important, but for that reason, they need to be, a good person will have a huge impact. A bad person could really lead people astray because the experience of standing there will have an impact and will, outweigh things that should have a stronger influence.
Yeah, I think last week I told you about my Girl Scout experience as a child. So it can go either way for sure. And the last question, Clinton is asking, just in general, and maybe this is more for the after party, he says, but anything else about the cemetery? Everyone's in the chat, and Clinton specifically in the Q&A is saying, like, your trip to the cemetery, they'd love to hear more about it. If you have anything
why don't we save that for the after party? And as a matter of fact, let me segue into the discussion of what that is. Okay, so for those of you who are new, what we do now, and someone of course instantly got bingo, what we are going to do now is segue into the after party. What that means is we will no longer be recording. We can continue the conversation in a less formal way, not that it was formal to begin with, but it can be even less formal. If you beamed in through the link, NCHE link, just stay right where you are and someone else is going to get bingo, and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are joining us through Facebook, you will need to leave Facebook and join us through ncheteach.org/conversations. And that will take you straight into the after party where we will have a big chat. So I will, before we poof head to the after party, I will say thank you for joining me again to engage in the discussions that make up democracy, the kind of talking that we need to have a successful democracy. Always grateful that you're there and that we're doing this. And I will, this is a good reminder. I was about to say, I will see you next week. No, Annie, I will talk to you. I have to go somewhere next Friday.
Okay, all right.
So we will, if I've talked to you about it, I will not leave a blank on Friday mornings, but if we can pre-record an episode, there's a conference I have to go to, and I thought I could leave later than this, History Matters, but I couldn't because of the airplane schedule, so I'm stuck. But then I'm around for a long time, so it won't be like I keep missing Fridays. So anyway, please come next Friday, even though I won't be here. It will still be live. It will be. And there will be a cool subject that I don't know what it is yet, but it will be cool. I will not personally see you next week, but I will be there. And then I will see you the week after.
All right. So if John will stop the recording.